My name is Imad Harb, and I am the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I am so pleased to welcome you to day 2 of Arab Center, Washington, D.C.'s 5th annual conference, the 2020 U.S. election, domestic and global implications. Today, we will build on the conversation we began earlier this week and take a closer look at the global foreign policy context of this year's historic election, key strategic challenges to U.S. policy in the Middle East, and how the results of the 2020 election may shape policy toward the Middle East and North Africa. I encourage you to join our conversation today on Twitter using the hashtag ArabCenter2020 and hashtag Foreign Policy 2020. And please send us your questions for today's speakers using the Q&A feature on your screen or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org. This morning's keynote speaker hardly needs an introduction. Dr. Tamara Cofman Wittes is a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution, where she focuses on U.S. policy in the Middle East. Prior to this, she served in a number of senior Middle East related roles at the U.S. Department of State, the Middle East Institute, and the U.S. Institute of Peace. Tamara is a published author and is currently working on a book on the tangled history of America's ties to autocratic allies. She is a co-host of Rational Security, a podcast on foreign policy and national security issues, and is a founder of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security. She serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Women in International Security. I really could go on, but let me turn you over to Dr. Wittes for her remarks.
Imad, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, or whatever time it is from the places where you are tuning in. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you this morning, and there's a fantastic panel of thoughtful analysts and experts coming up after my discussion, so I'm looking forward to that as well. I want to start by just saying a couple of words about my friend Khalil Jashan and thanking him for the opportunity to be here. I met Khalil, I think, almost 30 years ago now in Washington when he was running the National Association of Arab Americans. And I was working for a Jewish organization in Washington, and we were part of an interfaith coalition advocating for an end to the genocide in Bosnia. That was long before I went back to graduate school and became an analyst and academic. But the partnership that we forged and the friendships that I made in the Arab American community during that hard-fought effort have been a huge part of my career and my outlook ever since, and remain treasured friends. So Khalil, thank you. It's really great to be here. Folks, we're meeting at an inflection point in the role that the United States plays in the Middle East, and I think we've seen this debate play out especially in the course of the presidential campaign, but it's going to continue to play out no matter who wins in November. And so we see questions about whether the United States should have military forces in the Middle East at all, whether, if they're there, how many should be there, for what purpose, whether the United States even still has any vital national interests in the Middle East, and if so, what they are. Who are our partners in this part of the world, and how much do we and they really agree on what we're trying to achieve? These are fundamental questions, and they deserve a lot of discussion and thoughtful answers. And so amidst the rhetoric about defeating terrorism once and for all, amidst the rhetoric about ending endless wars, we need more honesty, we need more clarity about American interests and about the American role in the region. I think that partly the debate that we've seen emerge is a larger questioning about America's role in the world, coming off of a long period of very intensive international engagement in the sort of post-Cold War era, to question what we've achieved, what's valuable, and how much we should invest in sustaining the things that we've done over the course of this post-Cold War period. So I want to spend a few minutes examining what's changed in the Middle East and in the world that's pushing forward this debate about US policy in the region. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think it means for America's future role. So first, changes in the world that are affecting the way we think about the Middle East and its place in American interests. I think that one huge change, obviously, is that after a long period where the United States was sort of an unchallenged military, economic, political, diplomatic heavyweight, the unchallenged global hegemon, we're now in an era of renewed geopolitical competition. And I want to say that doesn't mean we're in a new Cold War, but that means that the United States is facing challenges to its primacy in the political, economic, military realms from Russia, from China, and it's facing challenges to its primacy in terms of sustaining that primacy at home. And that demands that we think about how we compete in the world. That's a very different challenge from the challenge that the United States has faced over most of the last 25 years or so. So as we think about how our economy competes with the Chinese economy, or how our technology competes with Chinese technology, how our energy industry competes with Russian energy, it leads to a conversation, I think, inevitably about the opportunity costs to the United States of being so deeply invested in one region of the world as US policy has been in the Middle East over the last 15 or 20 years. And the heavy investment in the last 15 or 20 years has been heavily military, but it is also political and diplomatic, and a huge amount of the time and attention of senior officials, especially the President of the United States. And so the opportunity costs of a heavy focus on the Middle East are rising for the United States, and that's one thing that's driving our debate. I think another thing that's driving our debate is the change in global energy markets. You know, when the United States first got involved in the Middle East, it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II. We were a massive, growing industrial power. We were hungry for energy, and we wanted to help secure the flow of fossil fuels, not just for the United States, but for Europe's economic recovery and for the world. And the more the United States became a global trading power, the more the supply of energy to the rest of the world became a vital interest for us. Our economy depended on other economies. Today, we're in an era in which Middle East oil as a share of global energy supply is shrinking. It's still very significant, but it's shrinking because other supplies have come online. Not only the shale revolution in the United States, but also new supplies from West Africa and elsewhere, and because more and more energy demand is shifting to non-fossil fuel sources of energy. My colleagues at Brookings who focus on energy expect that trend to accelerate. So during World War II, President Roosevelt met with King Abdulaziz to offer an American commitment to help the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia exploit its oil deposits and bring them to world markets. And for decades after that, American secretaries of energy would fly to Riyadh regularly to talk about how to keep oil prices stable and not too high. And we don't do that anymore. I can't think of the last time a US energy secretary flew off to Riyadh to talk about global energy prices. So Middle East energy matters less to us than it used to, and that's also driving this debate. Finally, we've seen a profound shift, I think, in the kinds of security challenges that the Middle East faces. And when I say a shift, I mean a shift over the last half century or so in which the United States has been a dominant force in the region. The kinds of challenges that drew the United States into the region, especially in military and security terms, were interstate wars, and especially the threat of Arab-Israeli war that destabilized the region in 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982, and that even threatened US-Soviet confrontation at a couple of points. And the US cared about those interstate conflicts because of that Cold War context. Today, the security threats facing the region are quite different. Civil conflict, mass migration, both conflict-induced and climate-induced, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and terrorism and insurgency. And these are very different security challenges that demand a different response. I'm not saying the United States doesn't care about those security challenges. It does, quite obviously. But 19 years of experience shows us that large deployments of American military forces are not the answer to that set of challenges. That's a subject on which Professor Bacevich has written eloquently. And that's driving a lot of our domestic debate today. So I think those are things that are helping push forward the debate that we're having in the United States. But this shift in our thinking about the region has come along with a lot of change in the region itself that is also affecting our calculations. In the past decade, we've witnessed a breakdown of the geopolitical order in the Middle East and a breakdown of certain states in the region that have collapsed into civil conflict. I don't think it's right to say that this disorder was created by the Arab Spring uprisings or that those uprisings caused the conflicts that we see today in Libya and Syria and Yemen. I think it's very important to emphasize that. The uprisings were the products of decades of slow change at the societal level, the economic level, technology, demography, and intellectual conversations taking place across the Arab world. And I think when the uprisings finally emerged in 2011, after Ben Ali and Mubarak fell, there were other leaders in the region who saw what had happened in Tunisia and Egypt and decided that if they just used enough coercive force, they could keep themselves in power. And so I don't think it's an accident that when we look at the region today, the places that have suffered the most violence, the most disorder, are the places where leaders like Bashar al-Assad and Muammar Gaddafi chose to respond to popular demand for change by turning their guns against their own citizens. Because when the government turns its guns against its citizens, it creates a market for other guys with guns to protect citizens from the government. And that's how you end up in a civil war. The breakdown of order in the region naturally unsettled even the governments that survived. And so we don't just have these civil conflicts, we also have an all-out struggle for power, a geopolitical competition amongst states in the region and states on the periphery of the region, like Turkey. And a lot of the civil conflicts have therefore become proxy conflicts for power and influence. And all of the violence, the competition, the disorder, all the anxiety of the remaining governments in the region for their own security and survival are felt in the United States as well, and in the pressures on US policy. Governments in the region that are traditional partners of the United States are anxious to see the debate that has emerged here. They're anxious to understand how much the United States still cares about the Middle East. And so the result is this sort of push-pull dynamic where governments in the region are working to convince the US that we really still need to stay deeply engaged and keep investing in them and their stability and security. But at the same time, they're worried that we're leaving, and that leads them to act in ways that are riskier, that are more aggressive, because they think that they have to secure their interests on their own without our help. And sometimes when they do that, they make things worse instead of better. You can say that about the Saudi and Emirati engagement in Yemen and the engagement of many different states in the region and outside the region in Libya. And you can certainly say it about the various parties who have intervened in Syria. So We have more self-help by partners in the region. We have a desire by the United States to do less, and we get this bitter push me, pull you. And so right now, I would describe the United States as in a kind of purgatory in its policy toward the Middle East, or its approach to the Middle East. We're not invested enough to establish a new regional order. In the midst of all of this disorder, it would take a lot for the United States to try and somehow impose a new order on the region, even if it could. But we're also too enmeshed right now to just get out. And let me be clear, by saying that there are reasons that the Middle East might matter less to the United States today, I'm not suggesting that the United States should walk away. I am not suggesting the United States should abandon its interests in the region. I can't tell you how we should resolve our national debate, but my point is that if we want to get out of purgatory, we have some hard choices to make. They're going to be ugly and painful. They're going to carry some costs and risks no matter what we choose. But I don't think that they are avoidable. Now, you know, I think one question is, to what extent has the COVID crisis changed that dynamic that I just described? To what extent has it changed the way we Americans think about the region? To what extent has it changed the way governments in the region are thinking about stability and security? And when I look at the region today, I see challenges and opportunity costs, but I also see opportunities for the United States to help make things better. I think the US does still have crucial national interests in this part of the world. And I do think it has the potential to continue to build its partnerships with the peoples of the region on behalf of a better future, because their aspirations and demands have been amazingly persistent, bravely persistent over the last decade of violence and disorder. And I think that those demands aren't going anywhere. So I think the challenge for the United States is to protect its remaining still important interests in an era of austerity and competition, without simply doubling down on the failed approaches of the past. I think that we could have a focus on constraining some of the geopolitical competition that we see amongst parties in the region, including our partners. We would do well with a different approach to confronting Iranian behavior. I think, you know, what you see is that President Trump escalated military and economic pressure to punishing levels, but never articulated realistic demands, never made clear what his priorities are with respect to Iran. And he swung between confrontation and sort of reaching out for dialogue. So the main results of Trump's pressure campaign on Iran have been international isolation of the United States in confronting Iran's nuclear ambition, new pressures on the American presence in Iraq, for example, and constant challenges to one of our vital interests, which is protecting maritime security and energy infrastructure in the Gulf. To my mind, the US has succeeded in deterring Iranian behavior over the past 2 decades, less through a beefy military posture and more through a coordinated mix of sanctions, of intelligence to interrupt bad behavior, multilateral pressure, and when necessary, the targeted use of force. And so an effective policy package for containing Iranian threats, both to regional stability and on the WMD problem, would offer a path to the Iranians to temper and ultimately abandon this behavior in favor of international engagement. That's not something we can do without close collaboration with allies and partners, and that is a feature that's notably absent from our current policy. I also think that if we're able to work more effectively internationally, we will also have opportunities to tamp down some of these regional conflicts that have given Russia opportunities for influence, that have given Iran more opportunities for influence, and that have become these proxy wars. And so I think, probably starting in Yemen, but maybe as we see now in Libya, there are opportunities for conflict resolution, and the United States needs to focus on diplomacy, working with others to seize those opportunities, not let them pass, bring these wars to an end. Finally, I think the United States, and this is one of the tougher areas of our policy going forward, the US really needs to reassess its partnerships in the region. If you think about the diplomatic opening between the UAE and Israel, for example, on the one hand, these are two American partners who have been highly valued and who quietly cooperated, but now they're willing to make it official. That should create opportunities for us to work together more effectively, for example, in confronting Iran. But as the United States builds on that kind of foundation, it needs to ensure that its regional allies aren't working together in ways that harm our interests or that compromise our values. For example, by enhancing the capabilities of autocratic governments to surveil their citizens or repress dissent. We need to make sure that the new weapons that we're sharing with our friends don't facilitate regional adventurism or encourage aggression. And we need to make sure also that when we provide more sophisticated weapons in the region to one party, that we're not creating a slippery slope of proliferation of sophisticated weaponry and demands for others to get the same thing. That's not good for regional stability. So the bottom line is, I think the US still enjoys opportunities to shape a more stable region that don't require expensive or long-term commitments. But I think that the tools will be a much more complex mix with diplomacy in the front and with less military engagement. The governments of the region are used to seeing our military engagement as this signal of our commitment. But I think if we look at the history of American engagement in the region over a broader period of time, we see that the most positive impact the United States has had on this region has been through diplomacy, especially its Arab-Israeli diplomacy. And so I'd like to see a return to that sort of focus in American policy. And with that, Imad, let me thank you and look forward to taking some questions.
Thank you very much for your comments. Very, very nice. A broad look at how things are. I have a moderator question. In your remarks, you mentioned the Trump administration basically knowing how to deal with its partners in the region. But these partners are almost diametrically opposed in how they look at things. An example here is the UAE. Lately, like last week or a few days ago, as a matter of fact, the UAE supposedly asked the United States to just simply close down its base in Turkey and move it to the UAE. How can the Trump administration, considering that it's not necessarily very adept at how to do diplomacy, how can the Trump administration reconcile all of these really diametrically opposed partners, so to speak, considering that Turkey is a member of NATO?
Sure. Look, it's not unusual for various American partners to have rivalries and contrary interests. Greece and Turkey have both been members of NATO for a long time, even when they have fought conflicts with one another. And the United States and other NATO members, through a lot of very intensive diplomacy and engagement, have managed to survive those kinds of conflicts. I think the United States, however, the US and its partners have faced a challenge in effectively confronting Iran, given the split within the Gulf Cooperation Council. I think that has impeded cooperation. And it's very clear that confronting Iran is something that all of the GCC states have an interest in, but these other issues have gotten in the way. So the United States in that kind of circumstance ends up being kind of like the child in the family when the mother and father aren't speaking to each other, but they'll both speak to the kid, right? And you can try to coordinate that way, but it's not very efficient. So part of the problem here is that I think so many governments are focused on the competition between them, and they're not necessarily thinking more broadly about what the vision is that they have for a stable, successful region, right? And the challenge of diplomacy is taking people who are arguing about different things and talking with them enough to discern where there are common interests, where there are common visions, and then building on those. I don't think that the geopolitical competition that we see in the region between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran is inevitable. I don't think it's inherent. These countries may never be brothers and sisters, but they can certainly get along better, and they have in the past gotten along better than they are right now. And so I think precisely the challenge is getting past the proximate disputes, the narrow disputes, and the ideology, and getting to what are the things we can agree upon about a region that is better than the one we're living in right now, and how do we get there?
Thanks, Tamara. I have a series of questions. To what extent has the Trump administration's policy influenced the state of affairs and order in the region, in the short and long term? For example, with regard to conflict, human rights, authoritarianism.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty narrow question. I think what I see most abundantly in the Trump approach to the region is that the president is not interested in communicating limits on the behavior of any interlocutor in the region on any issue. So whether it's intervention in civil conflicts, violation of UN arms embargoes, collateral damage in wars, or arms deals with China and Russia. Trump has not enforced any red lines, except once when he decided to bomb Bashar al-Assad in a limited way after a chemical attack. And I'm not going to condemn him for that at all. I think, however, that both allies and adversaries have come to understand that President Trump, more than anything else, is capricious. He changes his mind. First, he says he's going to pull all the troops out of Syria. Then he says we're going to keep them there to take the oil, whatever that means. So I think that it's left governments in the region just pushing on their own preferences as far as he will let them get away with. And that includes on domestic repression and human rights abuses, which we have seen escalate horrifically in the region. And it's not to say that the United States has the ability to prevent autocratic regimes from behaving in an autocratic manner. But it is clear that in the past, both Republican and Democratic administrations have tried to use the leverage they have available to persuade and to induce autocratic governments to improve on human rights. And Trump instead celebrates autocracy. So I think the no limits rule has been the one and only consistent rule of Trump policy in the region, and it's had some very unfortunate effects.
Another question. This is from Irsa Gursey. Where does Trump's Iran policy fall under the US disengagement paradigm? Even though a military confrontation between Iran and the US seems unlikely, it seems that Trump's hawkish, aggressive stance against Iran contradicts his promise to bring an end to endless wars in the Middle East.
I think that's an excellent point. Look, I don't have close personal insight into the thinking of the Trump administration, but let me try to explain what I think their theory of the case is on their Iran policy, which they call maximum pressure. So what does maximum pressure mean? It means we want to push these guys to the wall so that they have no choice but to concede, to negotiate on our terms. And the gamble there is that you push hard and you push fast to try and induce a rapid change in their behavior because they feel like they can't withstand the pressure. What have we seen? We've seen the Iranians, first of all, they've been under very heavy sanctions pressure for years. And so they are used to operating under sanctions. They are used to operating in an environment of relative poverty. And the IRGC has demonstrated an ability to survive and even thrive under sanctions because it makes money from smuggling. And it controls whole sectors of the Iranian economy. So Iran's most pernicious behavior in the neighborhood, setting aside for a moment the nuclear weapons program, its behavior in Iraq, in Syria, in the Gulf, is not impeded by the sanctions regime because the IRGC has enough money to do what it's doing anyway. Sanctions don't bother it. And so the Trump theory of the case that we could push them hard and fast and force them into a negotiation has failed. The danger in applying that kind of bullying theory of negotiation is that you might end up in an unwanted confrontation. And that's what almost happened in January, right? The Trump administration decided to just go that one step farther, assassinate Qasem Soleimani, and we almost ended up in a major military confrontation. And hundreds of civilians lost their lives when a commercial airliner was accidentally shot down as part of that cliff's edge confrontation. So there are real costs to that strategy. And I think we've seen that it's not effective. We need to try something else.
As a follow-up, I'd like to follow up with a bit of a question here. Is Trump really interested in striking a new deal with Iran?
Again, I can't read the man's mind, and I'm not going to try. But I think that we have seen evidence that he is interested in an agreement with Iran. He's offered several times to meet with the supreme leader. And I think at this point, the Iranian attitude seems to be, let's wait and see what happens in November.
Okay. Do you support the UAE-Israel deal? This is a very direct question. How do you reconcile praising economic, political, and military pressure on Iran while at the same time suggest that, I'm sorry, there is something here. Supporting a deal that encouraging sharing oppressive surveillance technologies and weapons with and between states that are known to abuse human rights and international law?
Well, I think you heard me in my remarks specifically say that I think the United States has an interest in dissuading its partners from sharing that kind of technology. Unfortunately, that kind of technology was being shared before this normalization deal was signed. The normalization deal is not what made it possible. And so I think that that's a broader conversation. It goes to a whole bunch of things. It goes to export controls in the United States, because we've seen that American contractors, with the support and approval of the American government, helped some states in the region develop technology that ended up being used in abusive ways. So the part of this is a problem we have to deal with here at home. It's not just about what other countries do. But do I support the Emirati-Israeli normalization deal? Yes, I do. I think it's a good thing on its own terms. I don't expect that it's going to have any particularly positive impacts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't think it was driven by a concern for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's driven by other shared interests that these two states have that have brought them together over a period of years, and now they're ready to take the relationship out from behind the curtain, so to speak. And I think that the timing of that decision has a lot to do with the fact that it's an election year here in Washington, that President Trump is hungry for diplomatic deals. And so the Emiratis were able to get a bunch of things from the United States that they wanted anyway, like F-35s. And the two parties were able to also position themselves well in Washington, no matter who wins the election, saying, look, here's a diplomatic achievement. You can build on it. So, you know, look, it's good for people to have diplomatic relations. It's good for societies to get to know each other and exchange views. You don't solve conflicts by not talking to each other. So that's all well and good. But I think we have to recognize both the limits of what that deal can achieve and also some of the ancillary effects that we need to watch carefully.
My colleague, Dr. Abdulwahab Al-Qassab, has a question that basically dovetails with the question I asked about the UAE and Turkey. With your experience with the State Department, within the State Department and American foreign policy in general, do you think that, you know, considering that this is not a NATO member, do you think that Iraqi bases in Iraq, American bases in Iraq, can substitute for the Incirlik U.S. air base in Turkey? You know, how do you look at that?
No, I don't think they can substitute. I think that while we see Turkey much more actively engaged in the Middle East and interested in influencing the region and engaging with other regional governments in ways that it hadn't over the last decades, it's important to remember that NATO was established with Turkey as a member to deal with the European theater. And so there are purposes to our presence at Incirlik that have nothing to do with the Middle East. Now, you know, there was a period of time when I think it was in the Eisenhower administration, the United States attempted to bring Iraq and Pakistan together with Turkey into a sort of Central Asian version of NATO. But even that was focused on containing the Soviet Union. It wasn't about Middle East security. So that's one reason why I think there's no easy substitution. And the other is that Iraq, sadly, is not a stable and secure place. And for the United States to you know, have a major installation with nuclear armed, you know, potentially aircraft and so on, you know, you have to feel very, very confident in the security of the environment.
In the last couple of minutes that I have here, I want to ask you a question about Saudi Arabia. You know, we know U.S.-Saudi relations are going through something. We know that President Trump wants to really, you know, get Saudi Arabia to have a normalization deal with Israel. We know that people in Congress are definitely very, very mad at what's happening with Mohammed bin Salman's policies towards his people, towards Yemen. What do you see in that coming? Whether it is President Trump who wins on November 3rd or if Joe Biden makes it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Imad. And I think it's important to recognize that the challenges the Saudis face in Washington are not restricted to one party or the other. And those challenges get to a very, very fundamental question about the US-Saudi partnership, which is, can we trust our partner? Is he a reliable guy? Is he a guy we want to invest in? And just as there are leaders around the world who have made an assessment of President Trump that he's capricious and he can't be relied upon because he changes his mind all the time, I think that there are senior folks in both parties in Washington who have watched Mohammed bin Salman's behavior. The kidnapping and forced resignation of Saad Hariri, the Ritz-Carlton abuses, the simultaneous, opening of social norms while cracking down on the very people who pushed those issues forward, and the horrific violations of international norms and human rights involved in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi that we're about to mark the 2-year anniversary of. So those things have led members of Congress and folks inside the administration to ask, who is this guy really? And how do we have a functional relationship with somebody who behaves in such a manner? And that's before you get to, the arms sales, the US arms sales to Saudi that have been implicated in civilian casualties in Yemen and so on. So yes, we're at a point of a very fundamental reevaluation. I don't think that's something that can be escaped no matter who wins in November. I think that there are still reasons to have a functional relationship. But I think as long as Mohammed bin Salman is committed to running his country and running his foreign policy in the way that he has, it's going to be a much more cautious relationship. It's going to be a much more attenuated relationship. And again, it gets to those tough diplomatic conversations about let's speak honestly to each other. Where do we agree? Where do we disagree? And can we trust that what you tell us about what you want is what you really want? And what you tell us you're going to do is what you're really going to do. And I think that that's a conversation that both sides should welcome, but it's not going to be an easy conversation.
Okay, let's see. I think we have passed our allotted time. Thank you very much for your remarks, Dr. Wittes, and we really appreciate your joining us today. I will now turn over the microphone to Dr. Lori Brand, who will moderate today's panel discussion. Please give Dr. Brand just a few seconds, and there will be just a few second intermission, and then we will resume. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.